A couple things that I mentioned to people that if I were grading them, I'd probably have given the point, but I know I've worked with other people who would grade them and say, oh, give everything wrong. Our job is to weed out anyone. So there are other people that would grade them more harshly. Is to identify one historical example of mass violence that was committed by a totalitarian state in the 20th century. Now, there are lots of examples of mass violence in the 20th century. The 20th century was the century of killing people. The most famous, of course, is the Holocaust during World War II, but also the Holodomor that Joseph Stalin wiping out all the kulaks in the Ukraine. Pol Pot's regime, the Khmer Rouge in Thailand, would be considered a totalitarian regime. Mussolini's regime and would be considered a totalitarian regime, and his assistance with the Holocaust would also be considered a mass massacre. There are events that happened in the 20th century that wouldn't count because they wouldn't be considered to be done by totalitarian states. The events in Rwanda, for example, weren't committed by a totalitarian state. They were committed by outliers who were trying to take control of the state. And even though it was a genocidal massacre, it wouldn't have counted, but no one had mentioned that. But almost everybody had an example, a totalitarian regime massacring people. When we start getting to study, I'm going to advise everybody to pick one act of mass violence, one genocide in the history of the world to know very, very well in detail, because it's going to appear in one of the essays or it's going to appear in one of the documents, but it's also going to be an example that you can tie into any essay that you write. So make sure when you sit down to study, if, for example, you're interested in the Holodomor, read about it, be able to write a page on that, and be able to tie that and compare it to any other event in the history of the world, and you have half an essay written before you walk into the test. One example of a democratic state committing mass violence that would challenge Rummel's argument, because sometimes democratic states commit mass violence. There was an example of the United States dropping atomic bombs on Japan, which is mass violence. We killed hundreds of thousands of people, and we consider ourselves a democracy. One of the examples that was in the literature for this exam was the firebombing of Dresden, which is a similar event where we burnt down, firebombed many factory towns throughout Germany leading up to our invasion of Europe. There are massacres in the colonies. So the Germans committed a massacre in Namibia, and the Belgians committed, well, the Belgians were run by Leopold, who was a king, so they wouldn't count as democratic. The British massacres in India under the Raj, the fighting against the Indian armies would count. Massacres of Native Americans by the British or the French would count. I would even go so far as to argue that the Holocaust counts, because Adolf Hitler was elected to be the Chancellor of Germany. He wasn't a king and he didn't take over, he was voted into power. And so you could make the argument that the Reichstag was a democratic regime. You could also make the argument that the massacres that happened in the partition of India were relative to a democratic regime. You know, India is a democracy, and yet 1 billion people or 1 million people died when India and Pakistan were parted. The one thing that I'd say is that if you're going to pick an example, pick one that's specific, because Just saying, oh, British violence in the colonies probably won't get you the point unless somebody's in a good mood that day, and is feeling generous. Be able to say where they massacred people, and or what happened. So talk about the massacres of protests in India, for example. Explain one development in the late 20th century that shaped Rommel's views of the relationship of democracy and mass violence. Of course, in the late 20th century, the Cold War ended, and there was this period of time when democracy was everywhere. The belief in democracy was at its height in the world, and everyone was saying that democracy was going to make all these bad things go away. Of course, it didn't quite happen. We got COVID instead, but that's one of them. The defeat of these totalitarian states during World War II definitely would have played into it, and somebody mentioned that. He mentions many democracies can barely bring themselves to execute even serial murderers, and the movement to end the death penalty worldwide could be an example of something that influenced him. And again, you guys did a very good job of picking out the examples. Most of the comments I gave individuals was about clarity and specificity. Come back. I'm going to ask everyone to tell me what your favorite event or period in history is. What you know the most about, what you like the most, whether you liked reading it on your own or whether it's something that you heard in a Kate class, what you find to be the most interesting, because I'm going to show you how to craft that into an answer to almost any question that they can ask.